The purpose of this lesson is to learn about methods and implementation hiding, how to write methods with no parameters and no return value, how to write methods that require single arguments and multiple arguments, how to write methods that return values, how to pass array values to a method, some alternative ways to write the main method header, and issues that you may encounter using methods in GUI-based applications. Throughout all of our programs so far, we have actually been using methods, and you may not have actually realized it. Every one of your programs that you've made has what is called a main method. The main method is just simply the section of code that's going to be called immediately when the program runs. Now, a method is a small section of code that typically has a very limited task and is considered to be what's called encapsulated, which means that all of the code that's inside of there is actually hidden from the rest of our program. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to make methods. We'll have separate methods for things like asking the user for input and performing calculations and displaying things to the screen. But to be able to do this, we have to invoke or call each of these methods when we want to use them. Our main method just looks like this. We have a static void main, and notice main has the parentheses afterwards. And then it also has a section of code, and it's designated by the opening and closing curly brackets. And then all of the code that pertains to the main method goes inside of those brackets. This is considered to be implementation hiding, which means that we are going to not necessarily let the other sections of our code see how our program works. We're going to create little sections of code, and each one works independently. And what this does is it makes it where we can design this little piece of code. We only have to troubleshoot a little piece of code, but we can also allow it where multiple people can be working on the same project. Each person has their own little section of code to maintain or develop, and we don't necessarily need to worry about how they actually do the work. What I do need to worry about, though, is how I'm actually going to invoke that other method. So how do I interface with it? What do I have to do to call it? I don't need to know how it works. I just need to know how to use it. This also allows for what's called a multi-file assembly, which just simply means that my program could actually contain multiple other files. We don't have to have just one file. Now, in Windows, we'll typically use what are called DLLs, which are dynamic link libraries. And what will happen is somebody will write a section of code, stick it in a DLL. I don't know how the DLL works, but I know what I can pass to it, and I know what I can expect to come back from it. So what happens now is I can use files that were written by other people. I don't need to worry about how they work, just need to worry about how to call them. Alright, so one of the major reasons for creating methods is we want to make our code easier to create and also easier to troubleshoot. And if I make methods, then I'm going to make it in small sections, and I only have to make the section of code for asking the user for input. Then I have to only troubleshoot that small section of code. So what it does is it makes it easier to create and troubleshoot. It also makes it where if I have the same section of code that has to run a bunch of times, I don't have to repeat that section of code in a bunch of different spots in my program. I can just simply keep recalling the same method. So let's say I want to ask the user for the price of an object. In the older programs, we would make a loop. So we'd say, do you want another object? And then if they said yes, then we'd have to go through this whole section of code for asking them what the name is, the price of it, if it's taxable, things of that nature. Well, in methods, I just simply have to say, do you want to enter another object or another item? If they say yes, then we invoke the method for asking for the object and getting the sales tax and so forth. It makes it much easier to troubleshoot, and it also makes it easier to make because I only have to troubleshoot small sections. It also gets rid of what's called code bloat. Now, code bloat is just simply repetitive tasks. So let's say I'm going to ask you in one section of the program for your name, and then again later in the program I ask for your name again, and then in another section of code I ask for your name again, and so forth. Well, instead of doing that, I'm just simply going to have a method somewhere that asks for your name, and then it maintains your name. Now, every method is going to have a method declaration, which is going to be the header. We'll go into what exactly is contained in there, the opening curly brace, and then your body, and then the closing. So we'll actually get into what these look like. Alright, so I have what's called a header, and this one says private static void show welcome message. Now, if you notice, show welcome message actually has nothing inside of parentheses, which means that this thing is not going to send anything back to whatever called it. We also know that because of this keyword here called void. This is what's called a return type, which means that if this section of code, if this method is going to return any data, what type of data are we going to return? Are we going to return an integer, a text string, a double, a float, or in this case a void, which means nothing gets returned? It is static. This is optional. What static means is that this method, once it's invoked, will remain in memory throughout the life of the program. If I create a method and I make it static, then it just simply means that that method will always exist. All of its variables will remain, and it'll stay for the life of the program. Private just simply means who is allowed to access this method. What other methods are allowed to call this thing? So if I want, I can hide my code, and I can also make it where somebody else can't call the method. We'll get into these access identifiers in just a little bit. We get into the curly brackets, and then everything contained inside of the curly brackets is the code that actually pertains to this particular method. So if I were to call show welcome message, all I have to do is call it. Once I call it, all of the code here will actually run. Alright, so we have what's called accessibility. We can limit who can actually see or call our method and who can see the variables and so forth. Our possible values are public, protected, internal, and private. Now, by default, if I just simply make a method and I don't specify one of these, it will automatically make it private, which means that nothing else can actually interact with it. Alright, so what do these mean? Alright, so the answer to that is, if I declare these as public, it means that every other method can access this method. Any derived classes can actually interact with it. Any other assemblies, meaning if I have other programs, other classes, other objects, can those actually interact with it? And can any other class actually access it? Can they call it? So public is going to be your least restrictive one. Everybody is allowed to talk to this method. Now you play with these, and you've used these before whenever you do something like a console.write, or console.writeLine, or console.read, or console.readLine, or anything. Those are public. I don't necessarily need to know how those methods work. I just need to know how I can call them. Alright, so then we have protected internal, and if you notice, any other class cannot interact with it. Only the classes that have been called by that particular method can actually access it. And so what we want to pay attention to is what is the most restrictive method identifier, accessibility identifier that we can use, and that's the one that we want to use. So if I don't want other classes to be allowed to interact with it, if I don't want other methods to be able to interact with it, if I don't want child objects to interact with it, I'm going to make it private, which just simply means that nobody else can talk to that method. That method is completely on its own. That method does not allow other methods to see its variables, and it doesn't allow other classes to even call it. It has to be from the same class, which means if I make a GUI-based form, only that form can actually call it if I make it private. You can't even have another form call this method. So we're going to play with these. We'll actually get more into those later on through our lesson. But just for right now, make sure you know that you need to use the most restrictive one. Alright, so we can also declare if these are static or non-static. Now, static just simply means that we can call it without referencing an object. Okay, I'll get into what that means in just a minute. What this means is that I can actually make a method static. I can call it. I don't have to specify a name for it. If you remember previously, we played with random numbers. We had to do something like random and then give it some sort of name equals new random. Okay, that is a specific type of object that I have to give a name. I'm actually going to create a copy of it and then put a copy of it in my namespace with this particular name. So if I did something like random randomizer equals new random, then randomizer was the name for it, and then we could call randomizer when we want it. And randomizer acted just like any other method. We could say, hey, give me a new number. Alright, so that's a non-static. A static method is one that I cannot call like that. I do not have to instantiate it. I cannot make copies of it. I'm just simply going to call it. It also will exist through the life of the program. So make sure you're aware that our static methods, we're just simply going to call them. They're going to be ones that maybe we pass numbers to, we get numbers back from, but I can't make duplicate copies of it. Alright, so every method has a return type, and the return type is what is it going to return back to the method that called it. So like I said, if we have a void, nothing gets returned. If I'm going to return a double or an integer or a float or a text string or anything like that, I have to specify it. If I don't specify one, it will automatically assume that it's a void, which means it will assume that it doesn't return anything. Alright, so the name must be a legal C# identifier. It has to match all of the naming requirements, the same things that we had with variables and all of our other objects we've created so far. So we can start with a letter, we can have numbers in it, we can have underscores, but we have to match all of the other naming requirements. Alright, so then we're also going to have parameters, and the parameters are going to be what kind of things is that particular method going to accept. So we have arguments and we have parameters. An argument is something that I'm going to pass to a method, and then when the method runs, it will take those values that I passed to it and put it in parameters. Alright, so the question is, where can I place these? Alright, so I have my class called hello class here, which is contained within the curly brackets. We have our static void main, so this is our main method right here. And what I can do is I can create another method anywhere I want outside of the main method, but still inside of the class, which means I could start it here, I could start it down here. Now, our conventional way to do this is we typically want the main method to be the very first one listed. It makes it easier to troubleshoot, makes it easier to figure out where our program starts. But it really doesn't matter what order these are in. The system will automatically figure out which ones it needs, and it will go from there. Alright, so in this case we have static void main, and if you notice we have a call to this particular method. So it just simply says show welcome message, and then it has the parentheses. And what that means is this system will automatically run this method as soon as main starts. So then it calls it. There are no parameters, no arguments or anything like that. We're just simply telling it, hey, show welcome message, do something. It is a private static void, which means that it can be called. We don't have to instantiate it. We don't have to give it some sort of other name. It will exist throughout the life of the program. And it's private, which means that only things within hello class can actually call it, and any of its variables, any of that kind of stuff, remain private to this particular method. Now, if you notice, there are no variables here. We're just simply doing console to write lines. So when main runs, main immediately calls this show welcome message. Show welcome message says, welcome, have fun, enjoy the program. And then what it will do is it will immediately return. And the question is, what is it going to return? Well, here you notice that the return type is void, so nothing gets sent back to the calling method. It will immediately return back to where it left off, and it will start the next line of code. Nothing was returned, so main just picks up where it left off, and it will say hello. So what this should do is say, welcome, have fun, enjoy the program, hello. Alright, so we'll actually get into how they work. We'll start making our own here in a few minutes. Make sure you know that we can have variables and constants inside of the methods. They are going to be local. Remember, we have this thing called scope, and scope means where do the variables exist in relation to sections of code. So we're going to have global variables, we'll have local variables. Global are ones that are created inside of the class, but not inside of a particular method. Local variables are ones that are created inside of a method. Now, the scope of the variables only exists during the time when the method is actually running. So in the previous example, if show welcome message actually had a variable, that variable would only exist when show welcome message is first launched, it gets constructed, and then when show welcome message is done, it gets deconstructed, which means the variable completely goes away. Alright, so we need to know where what our scope is, and what we want to do is we want to make our variables as shallow of a scope as we possibly can, which means that we usually want them to be local to the method unless we have some particular reason to make them global. All right, so we're going to pass some arguments back and forth. And the question is, what is an argument? All right, so let's pretend I have two people. The first person is responsible for asking the user for two numbers. The second person is responsible for adding those two numbers. All right, so what happens is the first person says, give me two numbers. And the user says 3 and 5. All right, so what happens is the first person looks at the second person and says, hey, second person, 3, 5. It doesn't tell the second person what 3 and 5 are. It doesn't care. The second person knows that it's receiving 3 and 5. It doesn't know what they represent, and it doesn't care. That's the whole purpose of this encapsulation. Neither method cares what the values represent. It just cares about the values. So what happens is the second person says, okay, I got 3 and 5. Doesn't care what they are. It adds those two numbers together, and then when it's done, it says, hey, first person, 8. All right, so the first person doesn't know how the second person did the calculations. It doesn't know about any internal code that the second person used. All it knows is the first person passed two numbers to the second person. The second person passed the number 8 back, and now our first person knows the number 8. That's all. All right, so what happens is we're passing arguments. The 3 and the 5 that got passed from the first person to the second person, those are arguments. The second person takes those in and will put them inside of local variables. So it'll put them into something like number 1 and number 2. And then it will add the two of those together and put it in another variable to hold the sum, and then it passes back the value of the sum. And one thing you need to be aware of is when we do this kind of thing, when we pass these arguments back and forth, we can't pass variable names, we can only pass values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass 3 and 5 over as an argument. Person 2 takes those in as what are called parameters and sticks it into his or her local variables. It does its calculations, and then it passes 8 back. So that's an argument being passed back. That's the return data. The first person picks that up and puts that back into a local variable, and then it continues on with this program. So we'll actually get into some examples so that you can see exactly how this works. But what you need to worry about is that you cannot pass variable names. You can only pass the values that are contained within that variable. All right, so in this case we have a private static void, which means we don't need to give this a new name. We're going to simply call it. And if you notice, it now has something inside of parentheses. So this is our method header. This is identifying how this particular method works. It's private, which means that all of its variables only exist for the purpose of this method. Nobody else can see its variables. Static, we can just simply call it. Void, it's not going to return anything back to whatever method called it. And the name of it is display sales tax. And it's going to take in a double value and call it sale amount. So what we're going to do is we have some method that's going to call this thing and it's going to pass a value over. So let's say the sale amount was $10. Then what it will do is we're going to pass 10 to it. It'll take the 10 and stick it into sale amount as a double data type. And this is the declaration for this particular variable. So imagine we declare the variable and instantiate it at the same time. We're going to initialize it. So we're going to say the same thing as something like double sale amount equals 10. Because what we're doing is we are creating the variable, we're declaring it, and we're going to initialize it with whatever value is being passed over at the same time. That's actually being performed right here. All right, so then we can also create other variables. So if you notice here we have a double called tax, and then another constant double, which is our rate, which is 0.07. So this is probably our sales tax rate. So the tax is equal to the sale amount, 10, times the rate, which is 0.07, and we're going to stick that into tax. And then it will write out to the screen the tax on 0, which is the sale amount, is, and then the tax to a string is currency, whatever the sales tax is. Now notice nothing was returned back to the calling method. It's just once this one runs, it takes whatever number was passed in and does stuff with it, and then when it's done, it'll go right back to the method that called it, and that's it. All right, so here's how it actually looks in a program. All right, so we have a class called useTax method. we have our main method. It's a static void. All right, so we have a variable called myPurchase, which is $12.99. So this is the purchase price. We're going to call display sales tax, and notice we say myPurchase. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to replace myPurchase with $12.99, and then it calls this method. So imagine this $12.99 being thrown over here. So we throw the $12.99 as a double, and this method is going to stick it into sale amount. All right, so then it takes the tax. It creates a variable to hold the tax. It has the rate of 0.07. It will take sale amount, which was $12.99. Remember, $12.99 got thrown over here. So $12.99 times 0.07 equals some amount, and it will display that out to the screen to show what the tax is. When it's done, then it will go back to where it left off, which is this line, and it continues running. So the next thing says display sales tax 35.67. So in this case, instead of passing the value for a variable, it passes a literal value, 35.67. So now it says 35.67. It calculates the tax with the sales rate. So now we have 35.67 times 0.07 is equal to the tax, and it writes that out as a string. So it would look like this. So the first time it ran, we passed the value of the variable, which was $12.99, and it calculated the sales tax. The second time we passed the literal value for 35.67 over, and it calculated the sales tax. All right, so we can also have methods require multiple arguments, and we can pass however many arguments we want. The only catch is going to be that we typically are only going to have one return data type. All right, so what happens is we're going to pass values back and forth. And if I pass 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments, then I have to know what order the method is willing to receive them, and I also need to know what data type the method is going to use. All right, so what happens is if I have a method that accepts a double and calls it sales amount, or sale amount, and it takes in another double called tax rate, I need to know that when I call it, I have to pass these in this exact same order. I can't pass them in a different order. They have to be the same. So what happens is if I pass in the sale amount and I pass in the tax rate, if the item price was $12.99, then I have to call it with $12.99 and then comma, and then the tax rate is 0.07. If I were to pass it the other way, let's say I sent the arguments over as 0.07 and then $12.99, then what would happen is this would pick up 0.07 and stick it into sale amount, and it would pick up $12.99 and put it in the tax rate. Now for this particular example, because we're just simply multiplying them, it would work, but we're actually not passing them the right way. We have to make sure that we pass the right data types, and they also have to pass in the correct order. All right, so when we call a method is at most going to return one data type. So if I pass 2 values over for the item price and the sales tax, then I expect it to either not return anything to me, or I expect it to return one value back to me. All right, so we need to know what the return type is, and that's declared in the header. It's declared as a return statement. All right, so what I'm going to do here in this case is my method is going to return something that is of a double data type, and it takes in the double for hours, and it takes in a double for rate, and it will return a value called gross. Now if you notice here, our method header only has 2 input types, but it has a return type. This means that the method that calls it has to have 3 parameters listed in the call. Alright, so when I call a method and I pass arguments to it, I have a couple of options if it's going to return a value to me. I can just simply use it directly, so what I could do is I could take that value and display it out to the screen, or I could put it right into a variable, which is typically how we're going to use the return value types. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the other method. I'm going to expect the method to send something back, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually set my variable equal to the entire call for the other method. We'll get into how that works in just a couple of minutes. But I have different data types that I can get returned. I can return things like doubles and strings and integers and so forth, but I can also return Boolean values. So if I wanted to, I could make a method that's responsible for seeing if something is true or not. Alright, so in this case, we want to call this method here called calcPay, and it takes in two parameters. So it has two parameters. Alright, now up here we have two arguments. We're going to pass values. Alright, so it's going to return something that is a double type. It's going to create a variable called gross. Gross is going to be equal to hours times rate. And then once it calculates this, then it's going to return the calculated value for gross. Now make sure you're aware, double gross here is a local variable, which means that scope only exists for the duration of this method to actually run. So gross only exists for a split second while it's performing the calculation. As soon as it returns gross back to the calling method, gross goes away. Alright, so my hours is 37.5, so that goes here. My rate is 12.75, and that goes there. And then gross pay is a variable that we're going to use to get some value back out of the method. Alright, so we're going to call calcPay. We're going to pass two arguments. We're going to pass 37.5, which will go into hours. We will pass 12.75, which will go into rate. And the only reason I know that's the way that's going to be is these are going to match the same order. So if this is 37.5 in the first item, it'll go in the first item here. If 12.75 is the second item here, it'll go to the second item here. There's no other way to control it. Alright, so I'm going to say calculate pay 37.5, 12.75. So calcPay says, okay, we're going to take 37.5, put it into hours, and we're going to take 12.75 and put it into rate. Alright, so we're going to create a new variable called gross. We're going to take 37.5 times 12.75, stick that into gross, whatever the total is for that, and then we'll return that back to our calling method. Now what happens is when we return it, it gets returned here as the value of the right side. And remember, whenever we perform an assignment, whatever the value of the right side is will get put into the value on the left side. So it will perform the calculation, it gets returned here, and then it gets put into gross pay. Alright, so then the next thing is this program will keep running, or the main method will keep running. It'll write out, I worked 0 hours, which was my hours, 37.5, at $12.75 per hour. And then it will say my gross pay is gross pay to string as currency, and gross pay was the value that got returned from the prior method. So what we end up with is something that looks like this. I worked 37.5 hours at $12.75 per hour. My gross pay is $478.13. Alright, so what we're doing is we're actually allowing the system to perform the calculation in the other method. We return the $478.13 back, and the receiving method puts it into gross pay, and now we can continue on. Once it gets returned, once we have gross pay here as a value, gross down here no longer exists. Also, hours and rate here no longer exist because this entire method only exists for the duration of it actually being run. Alright, so we can pass arrays, and to do an array, we're going to pass one value at a time. The problem with an array is we can't pass all of the values at the same time. We can only pass one. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an array, and then we're going to pass one value at a time to our method to actually interact with the array. Alright, so in this example we have an array. It's an integer data type called sumNums. It has 4 elements. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create an integer called x. We're going to write out at the beginning of the main method, and then it has a for loop. So from 0 through the length of sumNums, we're going to increment x by 1. And we're going to write out just simply what are all of the values. So it'll write out 10, 12, 22, 35. Then it will write a blank line, and then the next thing you see here is another for loop. We start x back at 0, all the way through the length of the array, add 1 to x, so we're just simply making our basic counter. And we're going to call this method gets 1 int. And then we're going to pass over sumNums and then x. So the first time we run through, it'll pass through 0, which is 10. Then the next time through, it'll increment x by 1, so now x is 1, and it'll pass through sumNums 1. Increment x by 1, so now x is 2, we pass through sumNums 2, and so forth. So we're going to keep doing this. Actually, we're going to call this method 4 times. Alright, then the method takes in one integer value and it calls it one val. Now you'll notice that when the method receives the value, it puts it into an integer data type. It's not sticking it into an array. It's just simply going to process one integer at a time. Alright, so what it does is it says console.write. So whatever it gets in, it will write out. So in this case, we pass 10 to it. So it writes out 10 as one val. And then it replaces one val with 999 and writes it out again. So what you'll see is that it'll write out 10, and then it will write out one val as being 999. It does this for every one of them. When this is done, all four of those are done, then it goes back and it writes out at the end of the main method, and it will write out the values of the array elements again. Alright, so what happened is in the main method, we had 10, 12, 22, 35. It takes 10, it passes 10 over to our method gets one int. It knows that it's 10, and then it changes the value to 999. Now the catch is that one val is a local variable to this method, which means that this variable, one val, has no bearing on the values that are in the actual array. It's not changing the actual array. It only knows the value of the elements of the array for the purpose of that particular method running. So even though it says that it changes the numbers, it only changes the numbers for the method. The original array gets left intact. We cannot touch the array when we pass a value like this. Alright, so what happens is if I really do want another method to modify my array, I have to pass the entire array to it. And we do this by what's called reference. Okay, so I can't simply pass 10, 12, 22, 35, or whatever the numbers were, all of them at the same time. I can only pass one value at a time. But I do have the option in C# to pass things by reference. And what this means is that I'm going to give the method permission to directly interface with the memory location for the array. Now be aware this is a little dangerous if I do this, because if the method changes the values of my array, it actually will change the values for the real array, which means I could end up with values that are incorrect. So be careful when you do this. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to call method gets array, and instead of passing the individual values, we're going to pass the entire array. When we do this, this is called passing it by reference, and we are giving this method permission to talk to this exact memory location. Remember, some nums here is a memory location that holds an array. So now what happens is our method will receive an integer data type of an array. It'll call it vals, and it'll take all of the values that are here and actually interact with them. Now the difference is when I passed arguments before, it created its own variable. When I create something by reference, I'm simply giving another name for this memory location. I'm still interacting with this particular memory location, even though down here is called vals. Alright, so what this means is that this method now has the ability to change the values. So what happens is, unlike the first time that we ran, we are going to print out the values in our main method. We're going to call our other method, get it to print out the values that are in the array. We tell the method to change the values, and then you notice when we go back to the main method, the values are actually changed. We will play with these more, but like I said, be real careful when you play with arrays with reference, because they are going to directly interact with the real memory location. Along with passing arrays by reference, we can also even pass multidimensional and jagged arrays by reference. So now instead of having to pass individual values, we just simply pass the entire array. We allow the receiving method to directly interface with that particular array's memory location, and it doesn't matter the size or the shape of the array. Now our main method, you'll notice whenever we've written a console-based application, our main method just simply has a header that says public static void main, or in a lot of instances it just simply says static void main. Now we can actually create what are called a parameter list here, and if you notice whenever we use the IDE, it will automatically create this type of header. And what you'll notice the difference here is that inside of the parentheses it says string, and then it has these square brackets and then args. And in case you didn't realize it from before, this is a method that receives a parameter of a string array type, and it calls it args. We actually are able to pass arguments into the main method. So the question is, if the main method is the first method to get run, and no other method is actually calling the main method, where does it possibly get these arguments from? I'll show you that in just a second. Alright, so in this case what we're going to do is we're going to create static void main. It has a string array. It receives data in the form of an array, and it calls it args. And so what will happen is we can pass arguments into the main method, and then what we're going to do here is args is going to be an array, so it has a length. So we're going to start off a counter. We start it at 0. While the counter is less than the length of the array, we're going to increment the array by 1, our typical counter. And then what we're going to do is just simply say console.writeLine argument, and then whatever x is whatever args x is. Now you notice args is the name of the array, x is the index. Alright, so the first time we go through, we're going to look at args 0 and display whatever it is. The next time we go through, it'll be args 1 and so forth. Alright, so the question is, where do we get these values? And we get them from the command line. When we actually call our program, we can pass arguments in. And you'll notice here's the name of our program, display args, and then we put a space, and then this is our first argument. So this would go into args 0. This is our second argument, so that'll go into args 1. That's our third argument, so that goes in args 2. And that's our fourth argument, so that goes in args 3. So then it'll say argument 0 is alpha. Argument 1 is beta. Argument 2 is gamma, and argument 3 is delta. Alright, so we're simply passing arguments in from the command line by typing them after the name of the program. You've probably done this before if you've ever used Notepad to open another program. So if you do something like Notepad space myfile.txt, you're passing an argument to it. You're telling Notepad, hey, open myfile.txt. And what you're doing is just simply telling it that's the argument. You may have done the same thing with Internet Explorer. If you ever call Internet Explorer by doing iexplorer.exe space www.google.com, then what you're doing is you're passing an argument of a website address and telling Internet Explorer to open that. That's the argument. Alright, so we can also have what are called return data types from our main method. Now, we're not going to necessarily pass a lot of data back. So what we're really doing is saying whether something was successfully run or not. So what we can do is our main method will run, and then it'll pass back either a 0 or some other value. That's what actually gets returned. And so what happens is if we pass back a return code of 0, that means that the main method ran successfully. Anything else would be interpreted as an error. When we write GUI-based applications, we have some special considerations. Anytime we make a GUI-based application, some methods are automatically generated for us. And what we need to know is what these methods are, and then also their scope. Now, they're typically going to be non-static, which means that we don't necessarily want them to be called by other sections of code. But what happens is every time I write a program, if I do something like make a button, when you click on it, there's an event that occurs. And when we pass an argument or something like that, everything that we do is going to have some what's called a sender event, which means what actually happened to it and what was the event. So the sender would be the button and the event would be the click. And what we can do is we can actually have our program keep track of it. So in this case we have OK button click, which means that we've double clicked on a button called the OK button, and it automatically created the section of code. Remember, a click event is our default event. And then we have two labels that are on the text or on the form that have text, and the first one is going to list the sender.toString. And what that does is whatever the sender was, remember, which is the button, would be written out as a string. And then our E is our event. And if you notice, we always have these that occur up here. Our object is a sender, and then the event args is E. So what we're doing is we're passing arguments in about an event and calling it E. We're passing in an object data type, which is the sender, and we're simply going to write this stuff out to the screen. So what that would mean is that if I clicked the OK button here, it would write out on the screen what the sender was. Well, the sender was a system.windows.forms.button. Its text value was OK. That's the text value up there. And then the event was a system.windows.forms.mouse event arc. So the mouse did something and had an event that occurred. So the event was the mouse did something. It clicked on a button called OK, and that's what actually was sent over to the calling method. Now we can use those that if you click on a button, we could actually display the text out for the button, or if you typed a text value in, we don't necessarily have to write out the text value. We could write out in an argument for whatever the sender was. Alright, so one of the things we need to worry about is the scope. When we declare a variable or constant within a method, it's local to that particular method, which means if I create a section of code for the button, for the OK button, if I create a variable inside of that method, it only exists for that button. You've experienced this before in some of your programs where you were supposed to keep track of how much money was earned, and every time you click the button, it would overwrite the value of the money if you didn't make it as a global variable. So if we make local variables, remember those go away every time the click event is done. So that when that method is completed, those variables are gone, which means the next time that it runs, it creates a new variable and we lose track of our register for it. So we need to make sure that we create global variables if it's something that we need other sections of code to be able to keep track of, or if the same method has to keep adding to an event, or not an event, but a value. So we're going to be able to add these to our class. We need to add it inside of the form class, but outside of the methods. Alright, so whenever we create these GUI applications, whenever we generate a method, we don't necessarily need to include static, but if I include static, then what that means is that that particular object, that particular method, can simply be invoked. It does not have to be instantiated with a name. I want to start making some programs using methods, and so what I'm going to do is I'm using my template. I have a namespace that I simply called call method. It's a class, which is the program. And I have my static void main. This is my default template that I've been using throughout the semester. And what I want to do is I want to create another method. And I want the method to be something that will display the company name. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new static method. And the reason I'm doing it as a static method is I want to be able to just simply call it. I don't want to have to instantiate it and give it a name and everything else. I just simply want to call it. Alright, so I'm going to say static, and in this case it's going to be a void because it's not going to return anything, and I want it to be called display company name. It's not going to have any parameters because we're just simply going to allow this thing to display the company name. Alright, so what I want this to do is I want it to do a console.writeLine. And the console.writeLine is going to be something like my company name. Okay, so I don't want the exclamation point. So what I want to do is I want to call this. Now if you notice I did not use an access modifier, so by default this thing is going to be private. However, I probably should specify it so that I know for sure that the system will treat it as private, which means that any of the variables that are contained in here are going to only exist for the life of this particular method. Other methods can access these variables. It's static, which means that other things can just simply call it by the name. It's void, which means nothing will get returned. And it's just simply going to write out on the screen the company name. Alright, so for me to actually call it, what I'm going to do is just simply list up here display company name. That's my entire command. So I'm telling the system main runs, then I want it to display company name. It'll jump down here and do the display company name. It will write this out to the screen and say my company name, and then it goes right back up here to where it left off, and that's it. Alright, so I'm going to compile this. All right, now I have my executable. So my executable is here. And I run it, and it just simply says my company name. All right, so I'm going to add my usual console.clear and my console.read, just so we can clear the screen and wait for the user to press enter. All right, so I want to compile it again. Run it. There we go. So now it just simply says my company name, and it's waiting for me to press enter. All right, so what I want to do is I want it to display this thing 3 times. So for me to display this 3 times, I could come down here and I could put this with 3 lines that say my company name. All right, so I'm going to compile that and run it. And now we get my company name runs 3 times. Now what it did is there was one call to this method. The method runs and displays this 3 times. All right, well, whenever we repeat something, we don't necessarily want to type it out 3 times like this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is instead, I'm going to put this inside of a for loop. All right, so I'm going to say for, and I'm going to make my counter, so int k equals 0. And I want to display it 3 times while k is less than or equal to 3. Then I want to increment k by 1. All right, so we're going to run this one line. So we're going to cause it to run 3 times. All right, so compile it, run it, and we get the same thing. Actually, I did it while k is less than or equal to. It should just be less than. Okay, so now we get my company name runs 3 times. The other option is instead of doing a loop down here, I can actually take this, move it from here, and put it up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to call this thing 3 times. So it'll call it the first time, display this. It'll go back up, call it again, display this. Go up, call it again, display this, and then it exits. So there are different ways that I can actually do the exact same thing. So I get the same output no matter what I have here. But by doing it this way, by controlling my loop here, I could have sections of code that are going to display it different amounts of times, or if I only want to display it once, or if I want to display it more than once, that I have more control over that. If I put the loop inside a display company name, then no matter what, it's going to display the company name that number of times. So now I get more control over it by doing it like this. All right, so I'm going to save this, and I'm going to save it as number 2 so I can modify it a little bit. All right, so what I want to do is I want to take whatever is in this method down here, and instead of writing it out in my code down here, I want to return a value back to whatever called it. Now, if I'm returning something, I can't have a void. Void means nothing gets returned. So if I'm returning something here, it looks like a text string, so therefore this needs to be a string return type. So I have my static method, which means I can call it by name. It is a string return type, which means it will return this text string. Then what I can do is I can come up here into my my prior code, and I can just simply say I want it to get that value back out of that method. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a console.writeLine, and what do I want to write out? Well, I want to write out whatever was returned. All right, well, the question is, what was returned? All right, so what I can actually do is I can call this thing inside of my console.writeLine, so I can nest my methods. So I'm going to display company name. I have to have my parentheses. And there we go. So I'm not passing any arguments to it, but I know that something is going to come back. And so this is going to get replaced with whatever this returns. Well, it's going to return my company name. It will replace this with my company name, and it will display that out to the screen. All right, so now if I run this, this one's number, oops, I should have compiled number 2. And then I want to run number 2. So my company name. So what it did is it does the console.writeLine, but this one inside actually gets run first. So when we nest them, the innermost one gets run the first time. All right, so display company name will run. It runs this thing, gets my company name, then it replaces it, and then it does the outer one, and it will actually write that out to the screen. I can do some other things. Instead of simply writing this out to the screen, I can make a new string value called str return, so whatever got returned, and set that equal to whatever comes back from this. And then I can console.writeLine str return. So what it will do is it will run display company name. This value gets returned, and then that value will get put into str return, and then it will do a console.writeLine of str return. All right, so save this, run it, or compile it, and then run it, and I still get the same thing. So this is just different ways of getting the method to return something. So like I said, you're either going to have one return data type or no return data type. If there's no return data type, it's a void. If there is a return data type, we have to specify how it's going to be returned. All right, so now if I try to do something like make this an integer, what's being returned here is a text string. And if this is a text string, I can't stick it into an integer data type. I have to know the data type coming back, or I'd have to convert it. So just like we've done throughout the semester, I have to convert things before I can actually do anything with them. Well, you've done that before, because what you've done is you'll do something like, let me add a new line here. So you'll say like int answer is equal to convert dot to int 32, and then in parentheses you'll do a console.read line. Oops. That's a method. Okay, so console.readLine was a method. We got back whatever came in, converted it to an integer, and then stuck it into here. So we've done this. We've used these throughout the semester, but now instead of using built-in methods, we're going to make our own. Go ahead and save this. And then this int line we need to get rid of. Then save it. Make sure it compiles. Make sure it runs, and it should have my company name. Alright, so now we're going to make a third one, and our third one is going to be a copy of our template, which I'm going to add my console.clear and my console.read line, so that way we don't have to wait for it. Alright, so I'm going to make a copy of my template, and this one's going to be Pringle underscore week 9 underscore number 3. Alright, so in this case what I want to do is I want to pass two numbers to a method, and then I want the method to add the two numbers and display it out to the screen. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new method, and my new method is going to be a private static void, because we're not returning anything, and it's going to be calculate answer. Okay, so in this case my calculate answer is going to have two number values that are going to come in. We're going to add those two numbers together, and then we'll display those out to the screen. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an integer value, and I'm going to call it num1. And I'm going to make another integer value and call it num2. So these are the same as me creating this variable and then initializing it with a value that will be sent from the main method. Alright, so now that those are there, now what I want to do is I want to take those two numbers and I want to stick them into another integer value for answer. Okay, so I'm going to make another integer value called answer, and I'm going to set this equal to num1 plus num2. And then what we're going to do is we're going to write out whatever answer is. So we're going to say console.write, and then this is going to be an integer value, so I want to use my text strings. So we're going to write out answer to the screen. Sorry, not write, it's the right line. So we're going to do console.writeLine and write out whatever the answer is as a text string. And then we're just simply going to display those. Okay, so how do I call it? Well, I'm going to call it by saying calculate answer. And I want to pass two values to it. So the first value is going to be 3, and the second value is going to be 5. All right, so what will happen is the 3 here will go into num1 here. The 5 here will go into num2 here. And then when it goes into these, this variable gets initialized, this variable gets initialized, and now we can use those for calculations down here. All right, so if I were to run this, save it, I'm going to compile it. Okay, so number 3. Okay, so there's 8. Now what happened was it took the number 3 and stuck it into, let me resize this so you can see. It took the number 3, stuck it into num1. It took the number 5, stuck it into num2. Then what it did was it took num1, which was 3, plus num2, which is 5, added those together and stuck it into answer. So answer is 8. And then it wrote answer out to the screen. Now, the 3 and the 5 up here, these are arguments. When they're received by the procedure, by the method, they become parameters. So the incoming value 3 and the incoming value 5 go into these variables. Those are now parameters. So they're arguments. The method that sends them, they're arguments. The method that receives them, they become parameters. All right, so the question is 3 and 5, where did those come from? So what I want to do is I want to make a program that will write out the answer for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my output a little bit, and I want to say the sum of, and this is going to be 0, and 1 is 2. Okay, so now I'm going to put these in order. So the 0 is going to be num1, 1 is going to be num2, and 2 will be answer. So what I want it to do is I actually want it to display the actual numbers to be being added together to give me the answer. Okay, so I'm going to compile it again, run it, and so now the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. So this method here is responsible for taking in the values, adding them together to stick them in the answer, and then providing that information back to out to the screen. All right, so I'm going to modify my code just a little bit. I want to ask the user for numbers instead this time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new integer value called int num1. And we're going to set that equal to whatever we read in from the screen. So we're going to say convert.toInt32, just like we've been doing, and it's console.readLine, because remember, whatever we read in from the command line is going to be a text string. Okay, so we need to provide them some sort of prompt so that they know what they're doing. So we're going to say console.write, enter a number. Okay, so just to have something for them to know what they're doing. And then they're going to enter a number. We're going to convert it to an integer and stick it into int number1. And then we're going to do the same thing. Console.write, enter another number. And then we're going to make another integer value called int num2. It's going to be the exact same thing, so read line. So this should be no different than what we've been doing through the rest of the semester. We're going to prompt them for something and get some sort of value in. And so now instead of 3 here, I'm going to pass int num, int num1. Okay, and this one's going to be int num2. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're asking them to enter a number. They type in a number, we convert it to an integer and stick it into int num1. Then we ask them for another number. They type it in, we convert it to an integer and stick it in int num2. Then we're going to call calculate answer, and we're going to pass whatever number they entered for int num1. That will go to num1. We're going to pass whatever they entered for int num2. That'll go to num2. it'll take num1 and num2 and add those together, stick it into answer, and then it will write that all out to the screen. All right, so let's compile it, run it. Okay, so I'm going to enter 3, another number 5, and the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. All right, run it again, 55 and 14. Sum of 55 and 14 is 69. All right, so what we've done is we've made a program where I can ask the user for input. They give the input, we put it into a variable, get the other input, put it in a variable, and then we just simply call the method that's responsible for performing the calculation and let it perform the calculation and provide the information out to the screen. I want to modify this just a little bit, so I'm going to save it as number 4. Okay, so now in this one, I no longer want calculate answer to actually write out the value here. I want to move this responsibility back up into the main method. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, in this case, I'm going to change these a little bit. So what I want to do is whatever I entered as int num1, I want that to be here. So this is int num1. And this one is int num2. And the answer is going to be some sort of integer value also. So I'm going to say int answer. Okay, well the question is, where does int answer come from? Well, int answer here is going to be whatever comes back out of this method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new int value called int answer and set that equal to calculate answer and then pass those two values. Which what that means is that this method here is no longer going to be a void. This one's actually going to return something. Well, what is it returning? It's returning an integer data type. All right, so then what I want to do is I'm going to calculate answer. I still have answer down here, and I want to return answer. So what it will do is I ask for the number, we pass that first number. We ask for the second number, we pass the second number. This will add those two numbers together, stick it into answer, and then it returns whatever the value for answer is back up to here. It replaces all of this with whatever the value for answer was. Then it will stick that into int answer, and then now we can actually perform our output here. So this one is no longer a void. It actually does have a return data type. So in this case, we're going to do number 4. And then we want to run number 4. Okay, so I'm going to do 3, 5, and I get the exact same output. Now the difference here is that this output was generated by the main method as opposed to being generated in the calculate method. I could, if I wanted to, I could make a method for asking for the numbers. I could make a method for calculating the answer. I could make another method for providing the output on the screen. And what we're doing by making everything these tiny little methods is this process called modularization. The whole point of this is to make my program smaller, easier to troubleshoot, and make it a lot easier to figure out what's going on. Alright, so let's go ahead and make this the modularized version. So I'm going to save this as number 5. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to create a section of code to ask user for two numbers. I have another section of code to perform the calculation. And then I have another section of code for displaying output. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I want to create a section of code that will do this for me, where it will actually ask the user for the values. Alright, so I'm going to ask them for the values, and we're going to pass them back in. Alright, so what I want to do is move this into a method. So private static int, and I'm going to call this get number. And it's not going to have any input value, so it's just simply going to have an output, and the output's going to be an integer. Alright, so this section of code is just simply going to be asking for a number. Now the catch is going to be I can only ask for one number and I can only return one number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say enter a number, And instead of int num1, I'm just simply going to call it int num. And then we're going to return int num. All right, so that's how we get the numbers. The question is, how do I get two of those? All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to make an integer value called int num1 and set that equal to whatever comes back out of get number. And then I'm going to make another one, which is int num2, and that's whatever comes back out of get number. So I'm calling this method one time and putting its value equal a variable equal to that value. Then I'm going to call the same method, which is responsible for getting the number, and we're going to put that value here. All right, so my calculation here, we're going to put that back into our calculate answer. So here's our, int answer. Yeah, we actually don't need this line. And then our output here is going to go into another method that's responsible for just simply displaying things. Okay, so now our last one here for displaying is going to be a void. So it's a private static void because it's not going to provide anything back. So I'm going to call this display answer. Okay, and it's going to take whatever the answer is in. So we're going to call it in answer. Okay, so now the thing is that I need to know what the numbers are and I need to know what the answer is. So this one's actually going to take in three variables. It's going to take in int num1, int num2, and int answer. So it's going to take three inputs. It has three parameters, so that way we can keep track of the two numbers that were added together and the answer. All right, so what I want to do is I want to perform the calculation. So to perform the calculation, I need to keep track of the answer that comes back out of it. All right, so we are going to get an answer back from this thing, and so we need to know what that is. So I'm going to make an integer value called int answer and set that equal to calculate answer. And what are we passing to it? We're passing int num1 and int num2. All right, so we're going to ask the user for the number, so we run get number, we put that value in int num1. We get another number, put that in int num2. We're going to pass int num1 and int num2 over to calculate answer. Calculate answer will take those two numbers, add those together, provide answer, and then whatever answer is gets returned and gets put back in int answer here. So then to display the output, then what we're going to do is we're just simply going to call. Now it's a void, so we're not setting anything equal to anything here. So I want to display the answer. And what am I sending? Well, I'm sending int num1, int num2, and int answer. Okay, because that's all that this main method knows about. All right, so we provide the code to get the number. We're going to stick it in int num1. We're going to get another number, stick it in int num2. We want to perform the calculation, so we're going to call calculate answer. We pass those two values over. We're going to get an answer back, so we're going to stick that into int answer. And then once we have the answer, then we're going to pass all three of these variables, the values of these variables, over to display answer in the correct order. And then display answer will actually display it out to the screen. All right, so to get the number, we're going to prompt them for a number. And then we're going to read it in, convert it to an integer, put it into int num, return int num, so that comes back here, goes into int num1. Do that again. This one gets put in int num2. Calculate answer is going to receive num1 and num2. It's going to take num1 plus num2 and stick it into a local variable called answer. It'll return answer. Now remember, these variables that are here only exist for the duration of this method running. So these variables go away when it's returned, these variables go away when it's returned, and all of this goes away once this has actually done its job. The only one that's actually going to remain persistent in this case is going to be our main method. So these variables will remain the entire time this program is running. All right, so let's go ahead and run it, make sure we didn't do anything wrong. File first. Okay, so number 5. Helps if you compile it first. So CSC Springle underscore week 9 underscore number 5 dot CS. Okay, so now I've got error messages here. So invalid token. This means that my curly brackets are messed up somewhere. So line 25. Here's a curly bracket. Oh, what that means is I put a semicolon here at the end of my get number. Okay, so let's try it again. Okay, let's see. An answer does not exist in the current context. That's on line 39. Okay, so this is display answer. Okay, and the reason for it is because I just simply called it answer here. So int answer is what that one's going to be called. All right, so we're going to go ahead and run this again. Try to compile it. That looks better. So now we can run it. Okay, so enter a number. Okay, so now right now it is sitting at this section of code right now where it says get number. All right, so enter a number, 3. And what it's going to do is when I press enter, it will convert it to an integer, stick it in int number, or int num, and it will pass that value to int num1. And then it goes into this next line. It called that same section of code again. Now this is that reusable code. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to get another number, so 3 and 5. We're going to pass that 5 back and stick it in int num2. Then we will call calculate answer. We'll pass 3 and 5 to it. 3 goes here, 5 goes here. It'll add 3 plus 5 and stick it in answer. Answer will be 8. 8 gets passed back as int answer. And then we have 3, 5, 8 being sent to display answer. And there we go. So now what I've done is I've taken my program and I've broken it up into individual little tasks. What this does for me is, let's say the section for getting the numbers runs and is correct, but the section where we perform the calculation, something is wrong. Then what that means is I only have to come down here to this calculate answer section of code and troubleshoot just that little section of code. I won't have to try to troubleshoot my whole program, just the section of code that actually failed. Alright, so last program, I want to play with arrays. So I'm going to copy my template. This one is going to be week 9 underscore number 6. And in this one, what I want to do is I want to make an array. And I want my array to contain some values, and I want to pass it to another method and let the method add numbers to it. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an integer array called, let's say, int nums. And I'm going to set that equal to 3, 5, 7, and 9. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to pass the array by reference to another method. And the other method is going to add 3 to each of the numbers, just to pick something for it to do. Alright, so what I want to do is I'm going to create another method. So this is going to be a private static void, because we're not returning anything back to it. And in this case, it's going to be called add to array. And so the question is, what does it do? Okay, so it's going to take in something that's an integer array data type, and I'm going to call it array. No. We'll call it array1, just in case array is a reserved word. And what this thing is going to do is it's going to have a for loop that says for each thing that's in the array, I want to add 3 to it. So for, and then I'm going to make a counter, k is equal to 0, while k is less than the length of the array, so array1, we're going to add 1 to k. And what I want to do is for each thing that's here, I'm going to add 1 to it. So I'm going to say array1 element k plus equals 3. So we're just simply going to add 3 to each thing. Alright, so it'll keep running this all the time. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to call this array, this method. So we're going to say add to array, and what am I passing to it? Well, I'm passing int nums. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to display the output. So I'm going to display it twice. I'm going to display the output before method. Okay, so I'm going to say something like console.writeLine array before method. And then I'm going to make a for loop, so for, and we're going to have our int k is equal to 0, while k is less than the array length. And just so you're aware, this k here and this k here are different scopes. So even though they're both k, I have to initialize k in this method and I have to initialize k in this method. So, so k is 0, while k is less than int nums.length. And we're going to add 1 to k. And so what I want to do is I'm going to say console.write. And what am I going to write? Well, I'm going to write out 0 and a couple spaces. And what is 0? Well, 0 is int nums k. All right, so we're going to write it out on the screen. We're going to write each element. And then what I want to do is pass the array to int nums. Sorry, add to array, I'm passing int nums. And then this is being passed by reference, which means that add to array is going to have direct access to the array. So I'm going to display the output after method. So console.writeLine array after method. And the exact same loop here, except I've already initialized k, and apparently I misspelled writeLine. I've already initialized k, so I don't have to initialize it again. I just have to reset it back to 0. All right, so from k up to int nums length, add 1 to k every time. So what I want it to do is display the output, so it should display 3, 5, 7, 9. Then we're going to pass the entire array by reference to add to array. And by doing this, I'm giving add to array direct access to my memory locations here. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through a loop to add 3 to each element. So this will become 6, this will become 8, this will become 10, this will become 12. Then we're going to display out on the screen 6, 8, 10, 12. So we actually should have these all simply modified. So by passing it by array, I'm giving it direct access to my array up here. All right, so let's go ahead and try to compile it. 9 _number 6. Okay, k does not exist on line 23. Okay, it actually is going to make me re-initialize it. And so it compiled this time. So Pringle underscore week 9 underscore number 6 .exe. And there we go. So 3, 5, 7, 9, that's the array before the method ran, and then after the method ran, now we have 6, 8, 10, 12. So by passing the array by reference like this, I'm giving add to array direct access to the memory location for my array. And by doing this, this method down here is able to permanently change the values that are in my array. In this lesson, you learned that a method is a series of statements that perform a task. Some of the methods will require information to be passed in, and their arguments when they're being passed, and their parameters when they're being received. We'll write methods to make our programs easier to understand and also make it where we can reuse our code. We can do implementation hiding, so we can actually hide our code so that way other methods can't see our code and our variables. We are able to pass multiple arguments to a method. We have to specify the return type, so it's either going to be a void or some sort of data type that we're going to return. We can pass an entire array as a parameter, and when we do that we pass it by reference, which means that the method has full access to the memory location for the array. We will see different main method headers depending on what kind of input we're willing to accept for our main method. And when we do write GUI applications, we do need to take into consideration that there are special circumstances that will occur when we work with senders and with arguments.